Eggs got awfully expensive earlier in the year. High path AI drastically reduced the amount of egg-laying hens that we had in the United States. The egg-laying industry had the most losses in terms of production. We're about 100 million layers short of what's needed to suffice cage-free egg demand.
Welcome to Unplugged, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association. This is the podcast where we strip away the fluff and get real about poultry science from bench to barn. I'm your host, Andy Vance, Executive Director of the Poultry Science Association. In this week's episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the volatility in the egg market, the future of protein pricing more generally, and the impact of high-path avian influenza, and the ongoing discussion about housing commitments in the poultry industry to this broader concept of market pricing and where the industry is going. In this episode, we're going to explore the complex economic landscape surrounding eggs and poultry as a protein segment and what that means economically. We're going to talk about HPAI, as I mentioned, and what continuing impacts on production look like for pricing. And doing that with us is a longtime friend of mine and somebody I've really looked up to. I consider myself a wannabe economist. This is a real economist, Brian Earnest, who is lead protein industry analyst at CoBank. Brian and I had a chance to work together many moons ago. He is the lead economist for animal protein at CoBank, where he specializes in market and industry research across the pork, poultry, and beef sectors. With more than a decade of experience in analyzing these markets, along with forecasting and procurement, including leadership roles at IHS Markit and Topco Associates, Brian brings a sharp economic lens to the most pressing challenges facing the protein industry today. He did his studies in economics, a bachelor's and master's degree at Eastern Illinois University. Brian, thanks for joining us on Unplugged. You've written recently about a surprising moment where beef appeared cheaper per gram of protein than eggs. So when I read that, my head almost exploded, because one of the things we've said about eggs forever is that, on a per gram of protein basis, it's the best bargain in food. What is going on with egg pricing at the moment?
Eggs got awfully expensive earlier in the year. First quarter of the year, we had bird flu impact on the poultry flock and drastically reduced the amount of egg-laying hens that we had in the United States, and specifically affecting production on the West Coast, in California, where they're only going to be sourcing eggs that are from a cage-free production system. So that kind of limited the opportunity for procurement for consumers in the state. So overall, this had a pretty dramatic impact on the market, the reduction in supply, and then also the demand side of it. We're coming out of a period where the fourth quarter of the year is typically really strong demand for eggs, kind of baking season and that sort of thing. And then we get a little bit of a lull in the first quarter of the year where the supply impact really kind of overtook any relief that the consumer would have seen there. So, at least a 1-2 punch in terms of what was going on in the egg markets. Beef prices rising too. And when I looked at protein per cents or per dollars, kind of comparing those two and what the consumer was seeing, these things actually got pretty close to each other. And that hadn't been the case for at least 20 years. So really interesting to see that. Now, coming out of that, we've seen egg prices come down quite a bit from where they were peaking in the first quarter, but still well above what we have for historical kind of typical valuation there.
It's somewhat easy to say, well, egg prices are up because high-path avian influenza. That's kind of a no-brainer when we've had the significant number of hens depopulated as a part of the response to that ongoing outbreak. But I think in reading what you wrote there and what you were just explaining, the situation is a bit more complex than just saying, well, bird flu. Like, there are a lot of factors at play. Walk us through, for you as an objective analyst looking at this market, those different factors and maybe the relative, weights or influence that you see as you start to pick apart the different dynamics that you mentioned just now.
The commodity in the egg space is really kind of that large grade A white egg. This is your typical consumer egg, kind of sits at the bottom of the shelf, and that's the one that most folks are gravitating towards when they're picking up eggs from the store. That was the case, 10, 15 years ago, but today you look at the case and it looks very much different, right? There's all these different specialty egg segments. And a big part of that is this movement towards cage-free production that we've seen. And that all really kind of kicked off in 2015 when we had several, I think there was somewhere around 130 different corporate entities that made commitments around only sourcing cage-free eggs. And the target date that they set for this was 2025 and 2026. And back then, I remember being in the industry and thinking, man, that's a long ways off, right? And I think most of the executives that were putting these commitments in place probably thought the same thing. Like, actually, we should either be able to make that target or I'm going to be retiring before we get there. So I don't have to worry about it. When you look at the commitments that were put into place, it meant that the industry to suffice all those commitments, and this is not necessarily talking about just California, this is talking about McDonald's, Walmart, Kroger's of the world, big retail, grocery store, food service, and distributors, all their commitments, the estimates I saw from like UEP or USDA, even when I was in Forma, we were looking at these numbers, trying to figure out, how many table egg layers are we going to need by the time we get to 2025. That number was around 220 million table egg layers, just in cage free. And when we look at production today, USDA estimates somewhere around 125 million. So we're about 100 million layers short of those commitments that were put into place and where we should be. And then on top of that, if you layer in these reductions in flock sizes from high path AI, it just, exacerbates that situation of a shortage, right? We're short supply of what's needed to suffice cage-free egg demand.
I'm glad that we're having this conversation because I think that piece of the story has gotten lost because the high path and depopulation is top of mind for obvious reasons. So when you look at this shift, and you're quantifying that in terms of the number of hens, if you were trying to pull apart and say, well, this is how much these cage-free commitments have increase the cost of eggs. Have you dived into some of those numbers to try to assign some value of here's how much that curve is shifted in terms of cents a dozen or something along those lines? How easy or difficult is it to do the kind of analysis I'm wondering about?
The interesting thing is when you look at USDA data for price reporting for cage free, they actually identify like a contract price, and whereas most other eggs are reported in what is the market fetching today in terms of like, your traditional open cry market, right? So if I'm going to the market and I'm buying truckloads of eggs, what am I paying? The cage free is more of a long-term contracted price. And it's whatever supply is available, that's available. It really assumes that there's no leftovers. So it's kind of difficult really do any in-depth analysis on what the true market value is for cage free. But overall, it's actually been reported lower than your conventional eggs. And at times that happens to be the case where, that contracted price may be above break even when you look at your inputs, but from a market valuation standpoint, maybe fetching a lower value in the market.
Yeah, and that's everything. It's a really interesting nuance in terms of the price reporting structure and, not looking at it apples to apples. And the other clear thing we've mentioned a couple times now is the persistence of high path avian influenza. We've been looking at this for a decade now as a major factor in the marketplace. So when you look at that over the span of time you have been analyzing this market, how has that changed the way you look at it and evaluate the markets as an economist now versus, when these outbreaks really started becoming more prevalent a decade ago?
I guess there's a lot to unpack. From poultry science standpoint, looking at factors of production, those have kind of changed over time. It seems like the egg laying industry has been most vulnerable, had the most losses in terms of headcount and loss to production. But if you look at a percentage standpoint, the turkey industry has been heavily impacted as well. And even there, I looked at some of the numbers kind of in the late 2024 timeframe, and it suggested that the turkey industry has lost a sizable chunk of their breeder flock as a result of bird flu. So that suggested some implications in terms of overall production this year. And that's one of those things that I think nobody's really talking about right now. But by the time we get to Thanksgiving, this is going to be a relevant conversation in that we have not inventory enough turkeys for Thanksgiving. And it sneaks up on us that, all of a sudden, hey, we're short turkeys for Thanksgiving, and there's market implications. And that's an industry where you can see pretty big market swings and high volatility as a result of people being surprised by a short market. So that's one of those, I guess, market aspects that I look at over time and try and evaluate what's going on there. For the broiler industry, we haven't seen as much of a strong impact on production, but we've seen a change over time in how markets have reacted or been impacted by high path AI. Back in 2015, when we first saw widespread outbreaks of bird flu in the US, it shut down a lot of export markets pretty much overnight. And the restrictions placed on imports of US broiler meat were at a nationwide level. Now we've seen more of a regionalization approach. So, while there's still been a pretty big impact to broiler markets from an export standpoint, there's, I think, been more of a global view of trying to make sure that they're conscious of putting the right restrictions in place as a result of these bird flu outbreaks.
Got me thinking about when we look at consumption, the demand side, what are we seeing there? My impression is that, we always used to say the only cure for high prices is high prices. So my assumption or perception is that higher priced eggs have consumers, maybe slowing down consumption to some extent, but is the data bearing that out? What's the demand side of this curve look like?
I don't know if you're familiar with the term Giffen good, but it's one where actually when prices go up, we see stronger demand. And at some point, they can't keep up with it. And these are typically goods that they're consumed across all income spectrums, right?
Mm-hmm.
But lower income households consume more eggs than maybe necessarily high income, right? And if the price of eggs goes up, they may consume more and they'll consume less of other goods to make up for that. To a certain degree, we saw some of that work into the markets in the first quarter this year, where the other reaction is I go into the store and I see a sign on the door that says limit 2 dozen eggs.
Yeah.
And I may have only been going in to buy 1 dozen eggs, but because I'm thinking, I may not be able to get them the next time I go in, maybe a bare shelf, there may just be scraps of eggs in the bottom. I'm going to take as much as I can this trip. And some of that panic buying played a role in the market this year. I think coming out of that, there's a little bit more supply assurance. The good thing about all this, I've been kind of saying since the beginning of the year, is that the hens that are in the system, they lay basically 2 eggs every 3 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
So despite the sinking supply, they're still producing. So there's production in the system.
Thinking about, the supply chain repercussions of this outbreak and the ongoing series of outbreaks, you're talking with folks in the industry. You speak to a lot of agriculture groups, a lot of poultry industry groups, stakeholder groups. What kind of feedback are you getting from those groups about kind of the stress in the system right now and how that's shaping decision making at companies and among producers and the different people involved in this discussion?
There's a lot of chatter about, how do we solve this problem? Because it's a big issue. It impacts the different poultry sectors differently. And number one, first and foremost, the discussion centers around continuous improvement and biosecurity measures. And this is one of those themes that I think usually kind of is the start of the conversation with the majority of the groups that I'm either sitting in on their sessions or listening to speakers or engaging with folks in the industry. There were a lot of learnings in 2015 about biosecurity. There continue to be a lot of learnings going on in the industry, trying to make things better. Now, what has happened over the last year is that they've discovered high path AI in the dairy herd, right? And I think I heard somewhere it was above 90% of the dairy herd in California contracted high path AI. Don't quote me on that number, but I'm pretty sure I've heard it a couple times. So basically embedded itself in the dairy industry and kind of using maybe the dairy industry as a vector to get into the poultry flocks. And I think this is one of those things that, is a learning, right? Now we have this information. What do we do with it? And how does the industry move forward to try to combat that issue? And I think if you look at a dairy farm, the biosecurity there looks very much different than what it would on an egg laying farm.
Absolutely.
Got animals going on and off farm every day in the dairy, right? And it's a requirement, really, to do business. You've got new calves that are coming and all the rest of it. So, and some of those grain trucks may be going to the same grain elevator for the dairy that they are for the egg industry. So I think that the industry is conscious of this, of what's going on there. They're trying to find solutions.
Talking about the biosecurity component, and again, thinking about all the different groups in the industry that you consult with or that the bank is supporting or talking with. You mentioned earlier those commitments to cage-free production and the shift of at least some percentage, maybe as much as 40% of the commercial flock now in cage-free systems. Does that make us more vulnerable as an industry when it comes to disease management, biosecurity, and mitigating risk to events like avian influenza?
I think there's two varying degrees of thought there. One, that we're increasing cage-free production in those systems as there's more vulnerability to high path AI. I think most could make the argument that that's true. The other side of that is, the industry is modernizing their laying facilities as they're upgrading these facilities, right, to cage-free. Some of these barns might be 40 years old or even older, right? So as a part of that capital influx that they're receiving, the hope is that they're ramping up biosecurity with that and trying to do a much better job there.
Yeah, that's a great point, and one that you'd think if you're making those kind of investments, probably a good time to look at the overall facility and make sure that they're up to snuff. And you, I think, made a great point earlier. The amount of learning that we've done on biosecurity more generally over the past decade, it is really not to be underappreciated. I want to think about consumers for a moment, their behavior. You talked a little bit about the stocking phenomenon there, maybe the counterintuitive nature of, hey, you told me I could only have two, so I'm going to take twice as many as I'd intended when I got here, just in case. We're not quite hoarding toilet paper like we were in the early days of COVID, but maybe a similar psychological phenomena. When you listen to consumers, maybe it's, family members, neighbors, maybe if you watch the nightly news or read the paper, what's your perception of consumers' current understanding of what's driving egg prices? Is there a big disconnect between the reality of the marketplace and consumer expectations, or have my colleagues in the news media done a reasonable job of telling that story? What's your perception, Mr. Economist?
The media in general, I think, clamored on this rising egg prices story in the first quarter of the year. It's not a new story though, right? This has been going on since 2022. I've had multiple media outlets reach out to me to try and get an understanding. And I think, I was even on some national news coverage a while back, and I had difficulty even relaying in simple terms what is going on to the consumer, right? To try and help them understand it. It's a complicated issue. And so that I think could give the benefit of the doubt to the consumer that they're trying to understand what the real causes of higher egg prices. But I think wrapped up in this is that we've seen higher inflation across the board. Really, the COVID era brought inflation in areas that we wouldn't necessarily anticipate, right? The toilet paper thing where, we didn't necessarily see those shelves being emptied in a lot of areas. So that kind of non-effective communication going on with the consumer, that's been, I think, very difficult. When I talk to people in my network, though, I try to do my best to fully explain what I'm seeing from a data analysis standpoint, right? These folks in California, they may not have necessarily asked for cage-free eggs, but that's all they're getting. That's all right. They're not getting anything else. That's all they can buy. And they may be rethinking that now from a legislative standpoint, but overall, there's kind of been a mixed signal overall, I think.
Well, I'm wondering about that as you watch, the marketplace, both the literal marketplace and the marketplace of ideas. It's a much different geopolitical environment today than we were when, let's say, some of these cage-free commitments came to the fore, or, when high-path avian influenza first became something that we were dealing with as a regular part of doing business. Do you think there will be any effort to revisit some of those policies or commitments, talking about, say, California and the example you were just using there, or some of the larger companies who said, we're all in on expecting our suppliers to be cage-free. Do you think there will be some reevaluation given where prices of eggs are now in some of those commitments and or policies?
There's potential that I think actually some states are looking at that. I think Nevada was one that it was in the process of thinking about rolling that back. I would caution a lot of that. just in thinking about the commitments that are made, some of them were pretty strong. Some were somewhat vague, actually. And in terms of intentionality, continuing down that same path is, I think, a good thing. McDonald's, I think, is one that they have continued to, in their earnings calls, talk about where they are in terms of their path to commitment. I think they're 100% today, at least in the U.S. production stream, which, you think about the complexities there. That's pretty remarkable to achieve in 10 years. But from a state legislature standpoint, it's kind of continue to question this interstate commerce clause. If one state has a relatively low production of eggs, maybe sourcing from another state that's a high producer, you always need to know your supplier and what their limitations are, right? I was in a sourcing role for several years, and I tried to have really open communication with our vendors of what we were trying to achieve at the end of the day, and help understand what their hurdles were going to be in that. And I think that's always very important. That's key, is understanding the science behind it too, right? What does it take to get there and achieve what we're trying to do? California has 40 million residents, right? And they have roughly 9 million table egg layers. I equate it to, you need one table egg layer for every human. And so that suggests, we need 340 million table egg layers in the US to supply all of us as residents. We've got about 300 million right now, so we're 34 million short. California, at the end of 2024, they had 9 million table egg layers, and they lost roughly 9 million in their bird flu outbreaks. So feeding those 40 million people, they're largely relying on other states to produce and make it over the mountains from Iowa.
Yeah, it's hard. We talk about the protein complex, beef, pork, chicken. But when you look at eggs, we could be talking about dairy as we were a little bit ago in the context of high path. Where do those products fit into the hierarchy of the consumer perception about value? Maybe this is even going back to our discussion earlier about price per gram of, or value per gram of protein. But how's that whole protein complex stacking up today?
Yeah, I'd say animal protein in general has benefited from, an influx of demand from the consumer standpoint over the last couple of years. Back to 2019, all of a sudden you kind of saw the surge of interest in protein in general, specifically kind of leaner meats. But also the beef category has gotten a surprising influx of demand.
Yeah.
I keep looking at what's going on in that space, and owed a lot to the efforts from the cattle producer. They identified in the late 80s and 90s that they really were not providing a very high quality product to the consumer at the end of the day. And the only way to really change that was to kind of start at the ground level and improve the genetics of the herd. And the access that the U.S. consumer has today for beef is just phenomenal. The amount of choice and prime product on the market, just to me, absolutely phenomenal. And we're, right around the peak of grilling season here, the beginning of July. And, it's just amazing, the swath of U.S. premium beef available for the consumer.
That's the thing I think that blows my mind. Again, as a kid who grew up raising beef cattle, I don't ever remember a time as a kid where you would see USDA prime beef in the grocery store. Like, if I went to $100 a person steakhouse, sure, I could, that we didn't do that. We didn't grow up. We didn't have anything, right? But you sure didn't see it at the grocery store. I could go to 3 different grocery stores, and I'm talking national chains, not specialty retailers. I could go to 3 different grocery stores in my town today and walk off with a USDA prime ribeye, probably under a certified Angus beef label or something along those lines. But that to me is mind-blowing in my lifetime. I saw a stat the other day, and I won't try to make up the number because I'll get it wrong, but the percentage of the U.S. beef volume that is prime today versus what it was 20 years ago. I mean, it's just been an astounding growth. I would say people respond to incentives, right? The beef industry, the pricing, grid pricing, and so on, gave the cattle producer an incentive to produce higher quality beef. Is that, number one, reasonable? And if so, how do pork producers, poultry producers, etc., take some of those lessons and apply them into the rest of the marketplace?
The cow-calf producers finally starting to realize that after several years of, really not getting their fair share of the beef price at the counter. Now they're finally getting it the last 3-4 years. And as a result, we're seeing, heifer retention is way down, so they're not building the herd quite yet. Maybe they will if weather starts to turn around. But the interesting part is like the average age of the cattle rancher in the U.S. is 58 years old today. They're kind of looking when does retirement hit for these folks? And
Yeah, yeah. See, Brian, what you're not thinking about is I got to get older to be able to afford to buy cows. That's what it amounts to. I'd love to have me 20 or 30 black baldies in the backyard. However, those are not cheap today.
I would agree with you on that. And my wife is one who would certainly love to have some cows around us.
My have is not, because that means she's got a lot more chores to do while I'm out traveling to Poultry Science Association meetings. So she's happy to only have to feed the dogs while I'm gone, let alone cows. But anyway, back to your point.
Yeah.
Okay, so the cattle producer, that cow calf producer, starting to get some of that is finally trickling back to that side of the producer. But you were saying.
Chicken has kind of fit into that value tier for the most part for the consumer on a commodity based level. Pork kind of sits somewhere in between the two. And, they came up with this pork, the other white meat, kind of around the 2000 era, which they were trying to basically say, we're a lean meat. We know you're looking for a lean protein. And to a certain degree, that did some damage for pork because folks overcooked it, which at 165 degrees, pork tenderloins don't hold up too well, or pork chops. So now we're seeing somewhat of a new campaign from pork, and I believe it's Taste What Pork Can Do. And it's reimagining pork in a different way. Part of that is trying to latch onto this desire for more premium meat from the consumer. They've gravitated towards beef. They understand that marbling and fat content is a good thing, provides a better profile from a taste standpoint. Fat actually has nutritional benefits. It couldn't be happening at a better time where, we're tight beef supplies. The demand is there. I mean, has a great opportunity to be reimagined by the consumer and kind of fit in that space. So that's where I see a kind of a key opportunity going on in all this is there's a big demand there for what could be a more affordable premium good. The challenge will be, I think, with, changing over the genetics in the pork industry, the hog, they've got some premium genetics, but reintroducing those in a bigger way probably is going to take some time.
Yeah, it's going to take a minute to get some fat back into those pigs. I mean, we just grew them too lean for too long. And I guess, if I'm thinking about an audience of poultry scientists listening to this, do we need to start seeing some research on how we think about the quality, the cutability, the fat composition, and so on of broiler meat? Is that a conversation, that needs to be had? Are consumers looking for more in terms of quality from the poultry sector?
There could be argument there. One of the challenges in the broiler industry has been, and I plan on identifying this in kind of an upcoming presentation I'm giving at a chicken marketing summit, that, the industry has been somewhat restricted in terms how many birds they can produce per minute. So they focus on, well, let's be more efficient and produce a larger size bird. And that does a couple things in terms of production, but backing up to the genetics piece of it, they want to utilize genetics that can be more efficient in producing a bigger bird size. And that's what we've seen in the broiler industry over the last 20 years is this gravitation from a genetics standpoint to how we check off all those boxes in terms of being as efficient as we possibly can, producing the biggest bird we possibly can with the least amount of feed and give the consumer a good experience. You're talking about giving the consumer a great experience, right?
I had to laugh when you mentioned Chicken Marketing Summit, which is hosted by our Poultry Science Association media partners at Watt Media. It's a great conference. I'm a big fan of Greg Watt and his team and Terrence. They put together a wonderful conference coming up here July 28th through the 30th. And I wanted to pull up the dates to mention to folks that they still had time to register and make plans to hear your presentation in Georgia. And lo and behold, do you know who the cover model is for the Chicken Marketing Summit website at wattglobalmedia.com? It is Brian Earnest. I love that. You're so photogenic on the podium there. But I'm looking forward to that presentation, Brian, because I think it's a really interesting conversation for the broiler complex to have in light of what we've seen from the beef industry. And you hit the nail on the head, I think, with what the pork industry is kind of playing catch up there, because they did try to position themselves so long as an alternative to chicken, because chicken was clearly dominating that space, either the value space for price conscious consumers or those super health conscious consumers who wanted a lean protein option. And now the worm has turned a little bit. Brian, as we finish up our conversation together, I've got a kind of a couple questions that are on my mind. One, what's the data? What's the trends that you're watching closely right now that you think are most likely to shape the poultry and egg sector over the next 6, 12, 18 months?
I do think bird flu probably sticks around for the industry as a challenge, but to the degree that they'll overcome that challenge, still kind of yet to be seen. So still monitoring what reported cases are, and actually they've been pretty quiet through June after a somewhat disruptive May. We're in the summer months, so my hope is that that'll continue and maybe the industry starts to catch up. What I've been hearing out of UAP is that the lead time for new pullets into the laying flocks is much longer, than typical. You're talking 12 to 18 months as opposed to what could have been 6 months before. So that's one of those data pieces I'm still kind of trying to monitor and figure out from a market standpoint, always looking at prices and trying to figure out what's going on there. So really kind of from a high level, trying to understand what production looks like this year. The demand is still there across the board. So those are some of the key metrics I'm taking a look at.
Okay, last question. I want you to pull out, your crystal ball here. What are the things on the one hand that keep you up at night as you look down the line? And then two, what are the things that are going to get you out of bed in the morning, give you excitement? The biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity you see for the protein industry and the poultry sector moving forward?
We talked about the dairy space and how there's been bird flu discovered there last year. And, as that as a potential vector. And, the poultry industry is trying to make a difficult decision in terms of vaccinating. I think if we start to see some developments there on the dairy side, that may be a welcome change. There's implications if the poultry industry starts vaccinating. So, that I think one of those key items that continue to watch keeps you up at night. On the flip side of that, things like I get excited about the demand side of the picture and the optimism there has just been absolutely phenomenal as a poultry analyst or animal protein analyst in general. After years of saying, how much is too much, the consumer keeps saying, I can't get enough, and animal protein. And, that used to be something that I had a lot of unrest about when I was projecting and looking at, what does the future hold for this market and these industries. Right now, it's, satiating that desire for more animal protein has proved difficult, which is a welcome surprise for analysts, and look forward to that continuing because the U.S. animal protein producers, they make a phenomenal product. Glad to see that they're getting the attention they are.
Well said, and we're going to leave it there. Brian Earnest, the lead animal protein analyst with CoBank, always one of my favorite coworkers back in our Informa days, and I still love listening to you talk markets and economics. I learn from you every time we get together. Friends, if you enjoyed the conversation, I would ask you to give us a rating wherever you listen to your podcast. If you haven't already subscribed and you just happen to be catching this via one of our social media channels or the PSA Postings e-newsletter, go ahead and subscribe. It'll be a fun conversation each week. And we bring together some brilliant expert like Brian will join us each week. Speaking of each week, next week, I'm sure that you will be with us in Raleigh, North Carolina at the Poultry Science Association annual meeting and North American Scientific Conference. Do please stop by and say hi. You can register on site if you haven't done so already. You can get more details about the meeting, including a look at our scientific program at poultryscience.org. Just head over to the meetings and events tab. While you're there, by the way, check out our absolutely epic program for our second annual PSA Pathways Summit. You want to sharpen your skills, increase your toolbox as a professional, come to our professional development event. The PSA Pathways Summit will be this October in Minneapolis. Registration is officially open, and I can't say enough, the program this year is absolutely fantastic. So poultryscience.org, meetings and events tab. Join us in Minneapolis for the PSA Pathways Summit this October. Until next week, for Unplugged, the official podcast of the Poultry Science Association, I'm Andy Vance.